Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome to Our Issues Birmingham. We've got actually our first guest when we started this program 10 years ago, I think. John Archibald with us. He's back.
Wow.
And he's back in person this time and not Zoom. John, welcome to the show.
Good to be here 10 years later.
He needs, you had some stops along the way too. He needs no introduction, obviously. Pulitzer Prize winner with Alabama Media Group. He writes a lot of pieces that are controversial, considered so by some, but quite frankly, he's opening people's eyes to problems that he perceives and we should know about. One of the things that I asked him to speak about when I invited him to be on our show today was something that's bothering me a good bit, and that is the fire that continues to smolder and burn in Moody, Alabama. You wrote something recently about that. The thing that bothers me about that, John, is it's been going on for so long.
2 months now. Oh, well, 2 months as we speak.
2 months to the point where people are talking about it. Right. But there's been an issue there for years that no one's talked about. And now it's turned into a flame, which is, even at my house, which is just off Dolly Ridge Road in Vestavia, I can some mornings go like, why is somebody having their fireplace up and running this morning?
Right. You can tell by the smell. You can tell, honestly, a lot of people say they can tell by the way they feel. Just not breathing as well as they have. I mean, it's a serious thing.
And so EPA is now involved.
Finally.
Who would you perceive has dropped the ball? This is a private property owner that owns this property.
What you have is a private landfill that's built as a green landfill, which means that the Alabama Department of Environmental Management decides it does not have oversight authority over it, because it is only supposed to take, limbs and trees and brush and things like that, not any kind of hazardous material, not any kind of tires, that sort of thing.
Paint, batteries.
None of that. But
so that's ADEM. So if we refer to ADEM, he's talking about the Alabama Department of Environmental Management.
Right, and which would ordinarily inspect landfills. And they've gotten some complaints in recent years, and in not so recent years, all the way back to 10 years ago, since before Our Issues was an issue. And they found multiple occasions in which more than green waste was being dumped there, and has cited them several times for that. But it's still not subject to ADEM oversight. In my view, you'd say who dropped the ball. It starts with ADEM, because they don't inspect them. It's not under their oversight because they don't choose for it to be, and so it gets sort of a skate, and that's where it starts.
Well, it was brought to their attention.
It was brought to their attention years ago.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
And they've known all along that there was the potential, not just the potential, but that there was more than that sort of acceptable waste there.
Does the individual that owns the property receive compensation to allow people to drop their things in that hole? Is it a hole?
Well, you're talking about things that don't belong there?
Yes.
That's a question I don't know the answer to. I mean, I would imagine that the probable answer is that they just aren't looking closely enough to know what's there, and that things are getting in that they may not, not. I don't know whether there's.
Have you been there?
Yeah, I've been up there. I haven't gotten a tour of the landfill, but
I'm not going over there. I'm not getting off at the Buc-ee's exit.
But I mean, there are a lot of these procedural problems. There's ADEM, and we only have a limited amount of time, and I'll be back in 10 years to talk again about how ADEM drops the ball on Alabama all the time. But the bottom line is that people think that ADEM is Alabama's version of the EPA, and that it's there to protect the environment, but it's not. It is the Department of Environmental Management. It's there to manage the environment and our relationship with business, which is sort of the Alabama way of protecting our environment. It's by making sure that we have business happy And so those two things are sort of in conflict at times. And this is one of them, because we simply put people's lives at risk. We put people's health at risk, primarily because we don't want to irritate business.
Well, why is it so complicated to put the fire out? I mean, I see acres and acres of California forest fires with these planes dropping chemicals over them and putting them out ultimately.
Yeah, the problem.
This seems contained to a small area.
Well, I mean, it's not that small an area, but the problem is that it's burning deep underground. I mean, I guess it's dumped and then it's covered up and then it's smoldering deep underground. And so, for 7 weeks after it started to burn, people in Central County and Moody and around that area who were left in charge with dealing with the whole thing, and because there was no state of emergency issued by the governor, we're struggling with trying to figure out how to put it out. And the question is, how do you put out a fire that's deep underground? And it's not as simple as dropping a bunch of water on top of it.
Does EPA have a plan?
The EPA has come in, and it was 7 weeks into this, the governor decided to issue a limited state of emergency, turn it over to the EPA, and the EPA came in, and the first thing the EPA said is that, this has been putting carcinogens in the air. And so, if you ask, you asked initially whether this was who is to blame for this? I mean, you'd have to put some of that blame on the governor, who delayed for weeks and weeks after, countless people notified her of the dangers and of their own discomfort, and it took a long time for the state to react.
Well, hopefully relief is on the way. We're going to take a short break, so we'll talk about some other lovely aspects of things that are going wrong. This is Our Issues Birmingham. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Our Issues Birmingham. I'm speaking with John Archibald. What we have been talking about is the Moody landfill, and what we hope is maybe a soon-to-come fix of a very serious and significant problem. So we shall see.
We're making progress.
That's a good step. Now, we have other problems in the state of Alabama, one of which is near and dear to me is our prison system, which is presently under the glare of the federal government about a takeover because of its deficiencies. But we also have issues that arise from our prison system, or probably more accurately stated, are part of the problem of our prison system, which is the lack of parolability for people who have served an incredible sentence, are on death's door, and we're still housing them to the tune of $28,000 a year per individual minimum, hoping they don't have a gallbladder rupture, because we've got to pay for that as well. And what I've spoken to Cam Ward about when he was the director was the lack of oversight in our parole board's activities, or lack of activities. You've just addressed that recently in a specific case.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a bit. Just what do you think? I mean, it's, as a lawyer, when you go down there, and I'm not supposed to, as an interviewer, I'm not supposed to be so much of the talker, but if you go down there with a client, it's comical. It's so ridiculous in how they listen to these people speak, some with victims against, some with victims not opposed. and yet they huddle like a three-man football team for a matter of seconds, sometimes minutes, and deny 90%.
Well, yeah, 90% right now. 91% is the rate of denial right now. I mean, or to turn that around, they're allowing 9% of parolees out this fiscal year, down from 50. I mean, it was 10% last year. It was 50% in the 70s. It's been on a steady decline, thanks to both some legislative changes and the ascent of Lee Guathny to the chairmanship of that board. And now the board is down to 2 members, and essentially what
I didn't know that. We only have 2 board members.
So it's so absurd, as you alluded to. If I wrote recently about the case of Leola Harris, who's dying in prison. She's in her 70s. She's not going to make it very long. Subel Cobb's group, Redemption Earned, represented her to get a medical leave, a medical parole, but it was denied. But just imagine, though, you've been in prison for 20 years, your parole date comes up. You don't get to go stand before the parole board like they do in the movies. You don't get zoomed in. If you have somebody speaking for you, they get 2 minutes each, up to 4 minutes. If you have a lawyer, you can get 6 minutes total to make your case that you've been a good prisoner, that you've learned your lesson, that you're worthy of parole. And they give you 6 minutes, and then they decide whether you should be allowed to go free. And in every one of those cases, both the Attorney General and Vocal, the victims of crime and leniency, send a person to argue against every one. And it's like it's so stacked against any real consideration of parole that people lose hope. You got very little chance of getting out, and that leads. And this is as you said, this is in a prison system that's so overcrowded that Jeff Sessions' Justice Department said it was a travesty, that it was a constitutional violation and inhumane, and at the same time we're facing all this federal trouble and some would say moral trouble for our treatment of prisoners by shoving twice as many people in as they're designed to hold. We make it more difficult for people to get out, and that's crazy.
And I think the fear and misconception is the people that are applying for parole are not the dangerous. They may have committed a violent act, but that act may have been committed 30 years ago. And now they're on death's door. I don't know how many that is. And I'm not talking about just those people. There are other people who are nonviolent offenders who are denied parole.
Yeah, I was looking at a case of an 82-year-old who was arrested in. He'd had a few property crimes in the 80s, and then was arrested. Walked into a convenience store with a knife, asked for money, was refused, ran off, or maybe he got $50 or something. Ran off. Nobody was hurt. He was charged with robbery. He's been in prison since 1988, and he's old and unhealthy, and went up for parole and no dice. I mean, it's like, at what point in time does a person pay the price for something like that? Is our question. And the medical issues aside, the woman Leola Harris we talked about earlier, she has diabetes. She has 6 other different things, and she's all of that now is required to be addressed within the prison, costing us money, when she had a nursing home waiting for her outside.
We'll talk more about it when we come back from break and some other things. We're going to take a short break. I have a couple of questions I want to follow up with on the parole issues. This is Our Issues Birmingham. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Our Issues Birmingham. We're talking about our prison system, which, of course, I work in that field. And, of course, I'm familiar with the problems that we've been talking about. We've been talking about parole primarily. We're down to 2 members. And as I said before, there's no oversight. So it's not like the director of the Department of DOC, Department of Corrections, has any authority. I don't think the governor has any authority.
No, and in some of the cases we've talked about, the DOC has been fine with the release.
Yeah, and the AG's office has, of course, their position, which never changes. And Ms. Gwathney is a former prosecutor, lifelong prosecutor. We don't know who the other member is at this moment in time because we just can't remember it. But what happens if one says yes and one says no?
Yeah, I mean that's
it's not going to happen.
So far, the case has been that Lee Gwathney has won, whatever that process is on that. And what you're saying is really interesting too, because staff at the parole, at the Board of Pardons and Paroles, has in this past couple year period recommended parole in say 80% of cases, and the parole board has gone against both the recommendations of staff and its own not regulations but procedures an inordinate amount of the time.
So we have one person holding the key to freedom.
Beth Shelburne did a piece not long ago that looked at a point in time in which Lee Gwathney was not at board meetings, took a leave, and during that period of time, parole shot up. So, I mean, that is the person with her, the finger in the dam there.
Draw your own conclusions. So, Governor Ivey recently issued an executive order directed at the prisons. But it appeared to me to be working from the inside out as opposed from the outside in, because we have a very complicated good time system in our statutes, hard to calculate. But instead of addressing what individuals should be given credit for good time, it basically spelled out certain rules for the inmates to follow to put themselves in a position to get the good time. I mean, isn't it obvious that if you're a good camper, you get credit for that? It used to be when I first started practicing law, it was if you got a 21 year, anything over 20 was different, but let's say you got a 15-year sentence. You were going to serve a third. Now, you serve 85% or 15 years, whichever is less, before you're eligible to be turned down. And if you get turned down, you get back in the batter's box 5 years later. You don't come back next month, 5 years later. Yeah. So what about this executive order?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are really still trying to figure out exactly what it means and what it means for inmates. And I can understand the need to have things spelled out in a way that people across the state and from prison to prison know exactly what their rules are and what they need to do. The thing that gives me the most pause about it, I think, is that it really makes I think that included in that is a possibility, and I'm sorry that I can't remember the right language I'm talking about, but there's some belief that people will be penalized more for speaking out against the conditions in the prisons, and that they can be written up for things like that. Of course, they write people up now for this 82-year-old woman we talked about who had an extra blanket was written up at one point in time for having an extra blanket. So, but, so I mean,
cell phones are a no-no as well.
Well, yeah.
But they're there. But they are in there.
That's a little bit different from a dying woman having an extra blanket. But,
no, I'm just saying those are the kinds of things that get you in trouble.
It can be anything. I mean, it can be all sorts of things. But if in the current environment, if people speak out against the conditions, that can be. I think that will be considered a hindrance to good time as well.
And I know a lot of you think it's prison. It's not supposed to be a walk in the park. And that is true. And we're not talking about trying to make it a walk in the park. We're trying to do what criminal sentencing should be about, which is to punish, to deter, and to rehabilitate. We have lost at least one of those.
Two, I think.
The deterrent effect.
Well, I mean, it doesn't seem to be working, but we make no attempt to rehabilitate or to release people onto the streets with a better chance to succeed when they had to get, with any chance to succeed in a lot of cases. And that's a whole different ball of wax.
Yeah.
But we should be concerned about the Supreme Court's rulings in the last few weeks as well, this is in regards to the death penalty cases where they not only, we've had trouble killing people in recent months. The last 3 were botched and delayed because they couldn't find the vein, and some were called it torturous. So the Supreme Court said, no, you no longer have to have a specific time and date to execute. The governor can set a range so that we can try to kill them for hours, and which is for humanity's sake, I think is a little bit of a rough thing. But it also, the Supreme Court said eliminated the automatic revisitation of court trials, for those convicted of capital murder. So once upon a time, if you had a drunk lawyer who went in and argued your case, that would automatically be reviewed. But now none of those cases will be automatically reviewed. Yeah. So we'll speed up executions, but we won't be as sure that we got the right people. Yeah. And again, the guilty should be punished. But if we punish people we just believe are guilty, then who's the criminal?
Yeah. Well, thank you, John. Very, very. Perhaps the EPA can put 2 fires out at one time. We could get them to drop a bucket of flame retardant on the parole board, and at the same time, while they're working on the Moody landfill.
Whatever happens, the leaders of our state will be talking about how terrible the EPA is within a matter of weeks.
Thank you all for being with us. This is Our Issues Birmingham. Thank you, John. We'll see you next week.